Mic check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and life events happen all the time that force collectors to sell huge chunks of their collection, if not all of their collection, because they're having to move. They got a new job. A family event has happened, which forces them to make major life changes. And so, whenever collectors put in that position, it's always tough because you want to hang on to your games, especially, when you're not just collecting to sell, but when you're collecting to keep and you keep the games that you collect, selling them can be really tough. I haven't sold any of the games that I'm super attached to in my collection. There are games in my collection that I've had for years now that I play from time to time. And there are some games in my collection that are pretty transient. I don't necessarily need to keep them. I'm not super attached to them. But for the most part, I want to say I keep about 90% of the games that I collect in my collection, or add to my collection. Of course, there are times throughout each year where I have to do a purge and remove some games out the collection. And really, all what a purge for the Y2K collector looks like is pretty much me just gathering together a bunch of games in my collection. Say me taking 20 games and trading them in for three. It's just kind of how I keep the number down to a certain point while still keeping the value in my collection. I usually try to do a equal value trade. So meaning if I trade 20 games that are worth, $500, I'm trying to get $500 worth of games back. It may not necessarily need to be the same amount of games, but it needs to be the same value. And that's typically how I just try to make sure I extract as much value out of my purges. Some people purge and just sell their games, or I don't know what they do, sell them to GameStop. My purges, a purge for me doesn't necessarily mean, losing value in my collection. So it's something that I've done for some time. But there does come a point, like I said, where you may have to sell. You may have to get rid of your collection because of life changes. And unfortunately, the Y2K collector may be in that position where I do need to either sell all of my collection or a big chunk of my collection because of life changes and a move that really won't allow me to take, 1,000 games and 50 consoles and, 20 handhelds and things like that. And I know a lot of times I just show this wall, but this wall is probably only 60% of my collection. There's like three other sections to my collection where I have all my Sega Genesis games, my Super Nintendo games, my NES games, my N64 games. I've got all my Switch games and my PlayStation 4 games, Vita games, PSP games, and then just all the consoles that I have in my collection as well, from PS1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the original Xbox, the Xbox 360, a few fantastic N64s, Complete in Box Dreamcast, Complete in Box PS2, NES, the Super Nintendo, Super Nintendo Junior. The list just goes on and on and on, with all the stuff in my collection. And when I think about being put in a position where you have to move fast, it's difficult to move fast with that much stuff. It's really just hard. When you're trying to trim down the amount of stuff that you own, the amount of just things that you own, it just becomes tough. And it goes beyond just selling video games. Sometimes you have to sell off a lot of clothes. Like if I've got boxes and boxes of sneakers, I can't travel with that much stuff either. You know what I mean? So sometimes you have to sell off sneakers. Sometimes you have to sell off clothes. Sometimes you have to sell off gadgets, right? Whether they be, DVDs or computers or camera equipment or, various electronics. Sometimes you have to sell furniture. I know that's the biggest one for me is, if I do, in fact, take advantage of some of the opportunities coming my way, I'm definitely going to have to sell furniture. So, but you know, unless it's like a chair that's been handed down from generation to generation, you're not going to be as attached to furniture. You're probably not going to be as attached to certain electronics. But when it comes to the video games that I've spent years and years collecting, that's a little bit different because there is some sentimental attachment to these games, primarily due to the nostalgia factor, honestly, right? The nostalgia factor is the big thing for me, and just what they mean in terms of, you know, the type of decompression they offer from just like the daily struggles of life. So if I do wind up having to scale down and, you know, get rid of a lot of games, what would I keep from the collection is the question. Like, what would Y2K keep? And I think for me, the first thing that I think of when it comes to what games I would keep is what games were the most difficult to get. Like, what games did I not see often at all that I had the hardest time finding? And obviously, that's going to be some of the more rare games. So, for instance, the Neo Geo games that I never spent money on, but I traded for. I don't know if I'll get another opportunity to make a trade for a copy of Last Resort. That might be very difficult to find in the future, and I know I'm not going to want to spend $700 to $800 for a copy of that game. Same thing with a game like Burning Rangers or Popful Mail, which I just got, or, you know, pretty much anything in my Sega Saturn collection, any of these like high dollar PlayStation 2 games. Same thing with a lot of, although like these GameCube games, to be honest, even the most rare GameCube games, I find these games a lot more frequently than like PS2, Dreamcast. You know, I didn't even get to the Dreamcast. And, you know, you start looking at games like GigaWing 2, GigaWing, those are for sure. Like GigaWing 2 is like super hard to find. So I don't think I would sell that. You know, Technomancer is another one that's difficult to find. Project Justice. Games like that are going to probably stay in the collection. When I look at games like Silent Bomber, that's a really tough one to find. I've seen Silent Bomber in the wild one time. One time have I seen that PlayStation 1 game. So there are certain games, man, these games are like tightly packed in here. It's crazy. Like, but yeah, there's some games that I've just never really seen in the wild, and they're just really hard to find. Even like an Otogi 2 or a Spike Out Battle Street. These are just really hard games to find. And yes, there's some of the more expensive games in my collection, of course, but I think a lot of that coincides with the fact that they're very rare, and in almost every case, they're very fun. They're really fun games to play if you're a fan of like that, the gameplay style. So, you know, it's gonna be a hard decision for me because, you know, as much as I want to keep the really rare stuff, a game like Teen Titans, which is a game I just picked up, I've only had this game for a couple days, but it's hit me with so much nostalgia. I'd have a really hard time selling this game out of my collection. Or like a copy of Raw Danger. Like, this is not something, or Disaster Report, you know what I mean? These are games that are really tough. So I'm battling with the you know, the idea of maybe possibly putting them in storage. But then, of course, when you put things in storage, that's another expense, right? That you got to pay to store the games. You know, you want to make sure you store them somewhere safe, somewhere that's climate controlled, where they're not going to get too hot, too cold. They're not going to crack. They're not going to suffer water damage. So, you know, once you start having to store games, it adds another headache. As opposed to just selling them. It's going to hurt selling them, of course, but it's one less thing that I have to worry about when I go on to my next destination and move into the next phase of my career and of my life. So I don't know what I'm going to do, to be quite honest with you guys. I really don't know. A big part of me is thinking about, you know, if I do wind up selling, maybe going to a game convention and maybe just setting up a booth at a game convention and just selling it all at a convention. I'm pretty sure a good chunk of this stuff would sell at a game convention. Probably not everything, but I think a lot of this stuff would sell. So I don't know if that's something that I decide to do. Maybe I'll do that. I know the Y2K crew, you guys will be the first to know if that's something I do decide to do. And, maybe for the first time ever, you guys can meet me in person, see what I look like, if that matters to you. But no, yeah, but in all seriousness, yeah, life events happen, life changes happen. And when they do, you kind of just, you got to be able to move fast and move lean. And so this is where we're at. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Should I do the gaming convention route? Should I just hit up Chase After the Right Price or Phoenix Resale and just make them an offer they can't refuse? um, you know, should I eBay all this stuff? You guys let me know what you would do if you were faced with these decisions, and I will catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.